In the summer of 1948, somewhere in the hill country of central Pennsylvania, a man named Elias Croft stood in the ashes of everything he had ever built, and he did not cry. He just knelt down, pressed both hands flat into the warm black soot, and stayed there until the sun moved across the sky and the shadows grew long around him. Neighbors who saw him said it was one of the most unsettling things they had ever witnessed. Not the fire, the silence after it. What burned that night was not just a barn. What burned was 60 years of living knowledge, seeds that had never existed anywhere else on earth. Tomatoes so large, so dense with flavor, so unlike anything a person could find in a market or a catalog or a neighbor's garden, that visitors who saw them for the first time often refused to believe they were real. People drove from 3 counties away to stand in Elias Croft's fields in August and hold one of those tomatoes in both hands like a child holds a pumpkin at harvest. Some of them wept, though they could not explain exactly why. Maybe because beauty does something to a person that they are not prepared for. Maybe because they somehow sensed even then that what they were seeing was borrowed time. By the morning after the fire, the seeds were gone. Every last one of them. And Elias Croft, who had been keeper of something genuinely irreplaceable, became just an old man on a ruined farm with nothing left to plant. This is his story. And it almost did not survive. The land that would become the Croft farm had been in the family since the late 1860s. Elias's grandfather, a man named August Croft, had purchased 40 acres of rolling hill country outside the small town of Mill Haven, Pennsylvania. After returning from the Civil War with one arm, a persistent cough, and a ferocious need to grow things, August had come from Bavaria as a child, and he carried with him something that almost no one knew about until decades later. A small oilskin packet sewn shut with rough thread. Inside that packet were seeds, not ordinary seeds. Seeds that had been cultivated by his family in the Bavarian highlands for generations, tomato varieties so carefully developed over so many growing seasons that they bore almost no resemblance to anything else available in America at the time. The details of how those seeds survived the Atlantic crossing are lost now. Nobody wrote them down, or if they did, those papers are long gone. But the seeds survived. And August planted them in Pennsylvania soil, and something extraordinary happened. The particular chemistry of that hill country land, its mineral content, its drainage patterns, the way the afternoon light fell across those specific 40 acres, combined with whatever genetic inheritance August had carried across an ocean, to produce something that defied easy explanation. The tomatoes grew. They grew enormous. Some years they reached 4 pounds, some years more than that. And they were not watery or hollow the way large tomatoes can sometimes be. They were dense and fragrant and so deeply red they almost looked unreal, like something a painter had imagined rather than a farmer had grown. August Croft said very little about his seeds. He was a private man shaped by hardship, not given to boasting. But he saved them obsessively. Every autumn, without exception, he selected his finest fruit, extracted the seeds with a care that bordered on ceremony, dried them on cloth in a specific sequence he had memorized from his own father, and stored them in small wax-sealed jars in the coolest corner of his root cellar. He kept records in German in a ledger that his grandson Elias would later struggle to read. Notes about soil amendments, about planting depths, about the particular qualities of individual plants that made them worthy of selection. This was not hobby farming. This was stewardship. August understood, in some wordless way that serious farmers understand things, that what he had was fragile, that seeds are not permanent, that knowledge is not permanent, that everything a person tends can be taken in an instant. He passed the seeds to his son Wilhelm, and Wilhelm passed them to Elias, and somewhere in that transmission something else was passed too. a seriousness about the work, a sense that the growing of these particular tomatoes was not simply a livelihood but a responsibility, a debt owed to something that came before. Elias Croft was born in 1889. He grew up watching his father tend the seeds with the same reverence that other men reserved for religious objects, and by the time he was old enough to take on the work himself, he had absorbed that reverence completely. As a young man in the early 1900s, Elias was known throughout Millhaven as an exceptionally quiet person who said almost nothing unless he was talking about his plants. Then, apparently, he could go on for hours. Neighbors recalled that he could identify individual tomato plants by their leaf patterns the way a person identifies a face. He knew which plants produced the most consistent fruit across wet years and dry years. He knew which ones held their color longest after picking. He understood his crop with an intimacy that modern agriculture has almost no category for. By the 1920s, the Croft farm had become something of a local legend. The tomatoes were sold at market in town. And there were years when Elias could have charged twice his asking price and people still would have paid it. But he kept his prices modest because he was not growing for profit in any simple sense. He was growing because he could not imagine not growing. Because these seeds had come from somewhere that no longer existed in the same way. From a lineage that had survived a war and an ocean and generations of difficult seasons. And to let them die or to allow them to become corrupted with carelessness felt to him like a form of betrayal. He married a woman named Clara in 1921. Clara Hess was the daughter of a German-speaking family from the next valley over, and she understood seeds the way Elias did, which was perhaps the most important thing about her in his eyes. They had 2 children, a daughter named Ruth who moved away after the war, and a son named Thomas who stayed for a while and then did not. This absence of an heir is a detail that matters, but we will get to that. In the 1930s, when the Depression made farming a slow catastrophe across most of rural America, the Croft farm survived in a way that astonished people. The tomatoes could not save them from financial hardship entirely, but they gave Elias something to trade when money was not available. And more importantly, they gave him purpose at a time when purpose was scarce. He worked the land as though it were a vocation. And in those years when he had more time than money, he did something that would later seem either inspired or heartbreaking depending on how you look at it. He expanded his seed collection. He began corresponding with other farmers and with a handful of agricultural researchers at Penn State, trading seeds and notes, learning everything he could about seed preservation and about the history of heirloom varieties. He obtained seeds for other vegetables and kept them alongside his tomato seeds in the root cellar, cataloged carefully in his own evolving system, some jars still bearing his grandfather's wax seals alongside newer ones. But it was always the tomatoes that mattered most. The tomatoes were the center of everything. The other seeds were interesting. The tomatoes were irreplaceable. The 1940s brought different pressures. The war meant labor shortages and supply disruptions, and Elias was in his 50s by then, working the farm increasingly alone as Clara's health began to decline. He wrote to his daughter Ruth in letters that have survived, fragments of which were shared with a local historical society decades later, that he worried about the seeds, not about the farm as a financial entity, about the seeds specifically, about who would tend them after him. Thomas had left by then for work in Pittsburgh, and though Elias never said so directly in his letters, you can feel the particular loneliness of a man who understands that what he carries will not be carried forward. In the summer of 1948, the tomatoes were, by every account, extraordinary. It had been a good year, warm and wet in exactly the right proportions, and the crop that August saw growing in those fields was the finest in recent memory. Neighbors stopped by just to look. Elias, who was nearly 60 years old now and moved more slowly than he once had, walked the rows every morning with his hands behind his back, studying each plant with the focused attention of a man taking inventory of something precious. He told his neighbor Harold Yates that year that he thought he had finally understood something his grandfather had been trying to do with the seed selection, a quality he called depth of root character, which Yates admitted he did not entirely follow, but which Elias seemed to regard as a genuine breakthrough after decades of work. The harvest came in late August. The tomatoes were weighed and recorded. Some of them exceeded 5 pounds. The seeds were extracted and dried with the same ceremony that had been observed every year for as long as anyone could remember. And they were sealed into their jars and placed in their careful order in the root cellar beneath the barn. Then, on the night of October 14th, 1948, the barn burned. Nobody knows exactly how it started. There were theories at the time, the usual ones: a lantern left burning, a careless ember from a pipe, spontaneous combustion in damp hay. The fire moved fast. The volunteer fire department from Millhaven arrived, but the structure was old and the autumn had been dry, and by the time the trucks pulled up, the barn was fully engaged. The house was saved. The animals in the far pasture were saved. But the barn came down completely in something under 2 hours, and it took the root cellar with it. Every jar. Every seed. 60 years of selection, 3 generations of knowledge, August Croft's oilskin packet, and whatever crossed the Atlantic inside it, gone. Not damaged. Not partially recovered. Gone so completely that when Elias went through the rubble in the days that followed, he found not a single viable seed. Just charred wood and melted wax and the warped, unreadable remnants of his grandfather's ledger. The neighbor Harold Yates, who helped him sift through the debris, said Elias did not speak for 3 days after the fire. He ate, he slept, or appeared to. He walked through what was left of the barn site and kept walking, all the way to the far end of the tomato field, which was brown and spent now in mid-October, and he stood there for a long time looking at the bare soil. Yates did not know what to say to him, so he said nothing. What do you say to a man who has watched 100 years dissolve overnight? What language exists for that particular kind of loss? It is not the same as losing money or even losing a loved one, though it carries something of both. It is the loss of a living thing, something that could not be replaced by any purchase or any insurance payment or any sympathy, because it had taken a century of careful human attention to exist at all, and that attention could not be summoned backward. Elias Croft spent the following spring trying to reconstruct what he had lost. He wrote to every person he had ever traded seeds with. He contacted Penn State. He reached out through a network of farmers and seed enthusiasts that extended across several states. He was looking for any tomato that might have descended from the varieties his grandfather had brought from Bavaria. Any clue. Any thread. He found nothing that matched. Some of the researchers he contacted were sympathetic and knowledgeable people, and they told him what he already suspected, but could not bring himself to accept. What he had grown was almost certainly the product of generations of careful open pollination and selection in a specific environment, shaped by both the original genetic material from Bavaria and by decades of adaptation to Pennsylvania soil. You could not recreate that through purchasing catalog seeds. You could not get there in 1 generation or 5. What August Croft had carried across the Atlantic in 1868 had spent 80 years becoming something specific, something singular. And now it was ash, and no amount of searching or trying would bring it back in any meaningful way. Elias continued farming for several more years on a reduced scale. He grew tomatoes from commercial seed. Neighbors who watched him work said something had gone out of him, which sounds like a simple thing to say, but which those who knew him insisted was literally visible. He moved differently. He was less absorbed. He went through the motions of a farmer without the particular quality of attention that had always distinguished him. It was as if he was doing an impression of himself rather than being himself. He sold the farm in 1955 and moved to a small house near his daughter Ruth in Lancaster. He died in 1961 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Millhaven Courier ran 4 sentences. It mentioned that he had been a farmer. It mentioned the surviving family members. It mentioned the funeral arrangements. It said nothing about the tomatoes. This is the part of the story that should bother us most. Not the fire itself, though the fire is terrible, but the silence after. The way an entire chapter of agricultural history vanished not once but twice. First in the flames and then again in the forgetting. Elias Croft was a man who had possessed something genuinely irreplaceable, and the world around him did not understand that until it was no longer possible to do anything about it. There are people now, seed preservationists and agricultural historians and people who work in seed libraries across the country, who think about cases like Elias Croft's and feel a very specific kind of grief. Not personal grief exactly, but something close to it. The grief of absence, of knowing that something existed and does not exist anymore. That there is a shape in the world where a thing used to be. Seed preservation was not a common practice in 1948 in the way that it has since become. Organizations that now maintain living seed libraries, protecting heirloom and heritage varieties from exactly the kind of loss that happened on the Croft farm, did not yet exist in their modern form. The idea that individual farmers might be the sole living repositories of irreplaceable genetic information and that their barns were, in a sense, archives that the world could not afford to lose was not widely understood. Elias Croft was not offered help because no one recognized that he was the kind of person who needed a particular kind of help. He was just a farmer with a barn and some seeds. Until he wasn't. In the years since, researchers who have learned of the Croft story, mostly through those fragments of correspondence that survived and through the accounts of people who knew him, have occasionally tried to trace the origins of what August brought from Bavaria. There are historic German tomato varieties that have survived in small collections in Europe, seeds maintained by botanical gardens and private enthusiasts, and it is possible, though probably not provable, that some of them share a distant ancestor with whatever grew on those 40 Pennsylvania acres. But even if a connection could be established, it would be a thin thread. The particular thing that August Croft grew into being through a lifetime of work in a specific place, and that Elias then spent another lifetime refining, that thing is gone. A cousin of it might exist somewhere. The thing itself does not. What remains, and perhaps this is something, are the stories, the accounts of people who held those tomatoes and could not quite believe what they were holding. Harold Yates's recollections, recorded by a local historian in 1978, in which the old man described watching Elias work the rows and said, and these words have stayed with everyone who has encountered them, that it was the only time in his life he had seen a man and a plant genuinely in conversation with each other. He meant it without any mysticism. He meant something precise about the quality of attention Elias brought to the work. The way he could read a plant the way a person reads a face. That quality, that knowledge, also burned in 1948. There is no university that could teach it because Elias never wrote it down in a form that survived. It lived in his hands and his eyes, and now it lives only in the memory of people who watched him. And most of those people are gone too. Somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, in a county archive or a church record, or the attic of someone who has not yet thought to look, there might be a photograph of Elias Croft standing in his tomato field in August. If that photograph exists, it might show a man holding one of those tomatoes. He might be looking at the camera with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a private person being photographed. And in his hands would be a tomato that weighed more than most people would expect a tomato to weigh. A deep, improbable red. The size of something between a grapefruit and a small pumpkin. The product of a century of careful human love. We do not know if that photograph exists. We have been looking. What we know is that Elias Croft lived and tended and loved his work with the kind of devotion that leaves a mark even when everything tangible is gone. We know that something he grew was genuinely extraordinary, that people drove for hours to see it, that it came from an old world and grew into a new one and became something neither world had seen before. We know that a fire on an October night in 1948 ended all of that, and that the man who tended it knelt in the ashes and did not cry, because some losses are beyond tears. And we know that in the spring of 1949, Elias planted again. Not the same seeds, because those were gone. Commercial seeds, ordinary seeds, nothing like what he had lost. But he planted because he was a farmer, and because the land was still there, and because the act of putting something in the earth and watching it grow is, for some people, not a choice, but a nature. He grew tomatoes until he could no longer farm. They were ordinary tomatoes. Nobody drove from 3 counties away to see them. He never spoke about them with the same quality of attention that Harold Yates remembered, but he grew them. Maybe that is what endurance looks like when hope has been burned away. Not recovery, not replacement, just the quiet continuation of a practice in the absence of everything that once made it extraordinary. Just a man and the soil and the seeds and the long habit of care. We will never taste what August Croft carried across the Atlantic. We will never hold in our hands what Elias grew to its full strange perfection. That flavor, that weight, that impossible red, it belongs now to a world we can only imagine, passed down through secondhand descriptions and the testimony of people who once stood in a Pennsylvania field in August and understood, without knowing why, that they were in the presence of something that would not last. Some things do not survive the night. And the saddest truth of the Croft farm is not that the seeds burned. It is that 100 years from now, there will be no one left who even knows to mourn them.